Hello, my name is Kevin Epifano, and I'm here to teach you about the history of Sparta and Athens. Now, I'm going to start this presentation off with a video clip from one of my favorite movies, 300.
This is Sparta!
Alright, so let's start with what it was like to live in Sparta. Now, not to get ahead of myself, but Sparta is a city-state in southern Greece. And if you can't remember what a city-state is, it's a city with its own government. So usually in ancient times, that meant it's a city with its own king. Now, life in Sparta was, as you can see or tell from the video, that it was very, very harsh. People in Sparta were tough, silent, and grim. Grim means mean. You're going to learn a little later on why exactly they were so mean. Now, from the time you were born in Sparta up until the time you die, you are devoted to war. This city was all about fighting wars. Now, another city-state that we're going to compare to in Greece is called Athens. Now, Athens and Sparta, even though they're in Greece together, so different. They're absolutely the exact opposite of each other. Now, Athens was a city-state in the eastern part of Greece, and the Athenians thought of themselves as like the shining star of the Greek states, meaning they were really cocky because they thought they were more intelligent than everybody else. They were really famous for their literature, their books, their poetry, their drama, their theater, schools, buildings, and government. People in Athens were generally peaceful people. Now, growing up in Sparta, community leaders examined newborn babies. This is how harsh these people were. If the baby was like skinny, looked kind of sick, maybe had like a pimple somewhere, they thought that baby was cursed, they would put it in a jar, leave it in the woods, left it to die. So really harsh ancient people. If you happen to be one of those babies that were, I guess, lucky enough to grow up to the age of 7, you would begin your military training. So you were given a cloak, a sword, a shield, and a spear. And you train for the next 13 years of your life. So until the age of 20. By the age of 12, boys, you had a lot of practice with swords and shields, but the whole time you only had like this one cloak as your clothing and a thin mat to sleep on. So no such thing as a bed or comfort at all. You would sleep on the floor on this little mat. Now, Spartan boys during training were not given enough food because they wanted to encourage them to steal from each other. They believed that encouraging them to steal food from each other taught them how to fight to survive. So only the strongest will survive. Like the boys, girls also, when you're growing up, you're trained in wrestling and spear throwing. And no, you weren't necessarily expected to be a soldier in the army, but the Spartans believed that if the women were strong, they would have really strong babies. Doesn't make sense to me either, I know, but it's ancient times. Spartan warriors were known for their skill and bravery. Growing up in Athens, however, the exact opposite. Athens girls, you guys stayed at home until you were married, all right? So until you met your boo later on, you stayed at home. Like your mother, you were kind of allowed to go to certain parties, funerals, visit neighbors for really brief periods of time, but your job was primarily with your mother to help her out in either the fields of the farm or the house. In most Greek city-states, all right, when young, the boys, you guys stayed at home until the ages of 6 and 7, and then you went off to school to learn math, to learn how to read and write, to learn philosophy. How did Sparta make their money? Now, Sparta's economy, as you can imagine, was based on farming, but that was more for food, and it was more based on conquering other city-states. So if Sparta ran out of money, they would just be like, you know what, we're like the best army ever. Let's go conquer somebody else and take all their money. So that's exactly what they would do. They did not trade with anybody. We talked about a lot of city-states before. a lot of civilizations that were all about trade. But the Spartans were afraid that if they started trading with other city-states in Greece or other cultures, that it would influence the Spartan culture and the Spartans would become weak. Now, in Athens, it was the exact opposite. They were all about trade, and most of the reason they were all about trade is because they had to. Athens was the center of education. So if you lived somewhere else in Greece outside of Athens and you wanted your child to have a really good education, you would send them to Athens. It's almost like in the United States, we think about universities like Harvard, all right, in Massachusetts. Athens was like the Harvard of ancient Greece. Now, they traded to support their population. So too many people started moving into Athens, so they were forced to trade with these other civilizations to make up for that. Athens, they used coins with artwork on them as their currency, as you can see the awesome looking Athens coin right there. Now, slavery in Sparta was very interesting. First of all, there were more slaves than actual Spartans. So that kind of gives you an idea of how rough and tough the Spartans were, that they can have all these slaves, outnumber them, and the slaves aren't going to revolt because of how brutal the Spartans were. Slaves did most of the work because the male citizens were doing war activities. So, like I said, Sparta's all about war, especially if you're a guy. So usually the slaves would be working your farms and doing all that stuff for you. It was legal to kill slaves to keep them from rebelling. So another reason why Sparta was able to have such a large population of slaves. In Athens, however, it was a lot different for a slave. Slaves could learn how to be artists, farmers. They were treated almost like they were free, except they worked for free, so they were slaves. They also taught other people's children, too, so they learned how to be teachers. They could buy their freedom by selling leftover crops. Women in Sparta, as we mentioned before, were really rough and tough, sort of like the men. So they didn't wear really pretty clothing, dresses, or anything like that. They were really plain, not really, concerned with their physical appearance. Actually, there was an ancient Greek historian that wrote about Spartan women and said when they visited Sparta, it was hard to tell the difference between the men and the women. So a little insult to them. Now, Spartan women were allowed to own property, which was a really big deal in ancient times. Spartan women to have the right to own property was huge. In Athens, however, it was actually different. So this is where it might get confusing because we talk about Sparta and they're so rough and tough, so you would expect them to be like really rigid with their women. But actually, Athens was more rigid with their women. Women in Athens did not have many rights at all. They were not considered citizens, and their main job was just primarily in the house. They were not allowed to be educated, how to read and write, any of that. And they weren't even allowed outside of their homes without being accompanied by their husbands. So thinking about growing up as a little girl, like your age basically, you're just stuck in the house until you meet your husband. And by what I mean by meet your husband is your dad's going to pick who your husband is, and that's it. Government in Sparta. Sparta's government was ruled by what we call an oligarchy. Now, you're going to learn a lot about this form of government next year in civics, but basically an oligarchy is a government ruled by like 2 or 3 people. And in Sparta's case, Sparta was ruled by 2 kings, and they had these 28 council members that would help them out with tough situations. But yes, it was primarily owned by these 2 kings. They would create these laws, and they also had an assembly that was made up of male citizens over the age of 30 that voted on these laws. Athens is really, really famous for their government, and it should sound really familiar to us. Athens created a form of government that is called democracy, and democracy is a Greek word that means power of the people. Now, it's a government ruled by the citizens that live within that city-state. So there was no kings or anything like that. All the citizens had the power. Well, male citizens. Now, democracy was such a good idea that even thousands of years later, we use it today in the United States. In Athens, they had a council, which is a group of people of 500 that would create laws that were then voted on by a bigger assembly. And this assembly couldn't vote unless they had 6,000 participants from Athens. Now, as you can imagine, Sparta and Athens being so different that they're going to clash at some point. And they eventually do, okay? These guys did not like each other. They hated each other. Sparta thought they were the best because they were strong, they were warriors. Athens thought they were the best because they were smart, they were into the arts. They thought the Spartans were just stupid people. So they clashed together in what we call the Peloponnesian War, and this was a war that lasted for 27 years in the year 431 BC. Now, early on in the war, it wasn't fair to the Athenians because they got hit by this giant plague, which is a widespread disease, and even this plague, it killed a lot of people, a third of the people in Athens. So they were already weak from the get-go. Also, when you fight a war against Sparta, Sparta obviously has the advantage because they do nothing but, like I said, eat, sleep, and breathe war. Now, the final moments of Athens happen when Sparta surrounds the city-state with its soldiers, and they cut off any kind of food or supplies going into the city. They wait for the Athenians to starve, almost starve to death, and then they go over the walls with ladders and they take over the city of Athens. Once again, my name is Kevin Epifano, and it's been a pleasure going over the history of Sparta and Athens.